The first light over Sabi Sands did not rise like a bold declaration, but rather unfolded softly, as though the night were reluctant to let go. The tall marula trees stood like patient guardians, their branches etched against a pale lavender sky. Mist clung low to the riverbeds, drifting in silvery bands that moved with the languid grace of breath. Everywhere, life was waking, tiny tentative sounds that formed a quiet symphony of beginnings. The world smelled of wet grass, warm earth, and the faint sweetness of wild sage, crushed by wandering elephants hours before dawn. Ranger Elias Thando walked slowly along the familiar dirt path that wound from the ranger station to the river. At 58, each step carried a small echo of age, tightness in the knees, a stiffness in the back, but his stride retained its purpose. Tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered like an old cliff face, Elias moved with the steady calm of someone who had lived more than half his life in communion with wild things. His hair, once dark as obsidian, had faded to the color of ash, and deep lines framed his eyes, lines carved by sun, storms, and years of watching animals live and die. He carried a metal mug of coffee, still steaming in the cool morning air. As he paused at the ridge overlooking the river, he inhaled deeply. This was his ritual, almost sacred, greeting the dawn alone, listening to the whispers of a landscape that had raised him, healed him, and haunted him. He thought of the animals he had protected, some saved, some lost, and how each memory lived inside him like quiet fires that never fully went out. He was not a man of many words. Solitude had become his companion, not by choice, but by inevitability. The wilderness had a way of claiming certain hearts, especially those cracked by loss. Years ago, he had lost someone human, and since then, he had found comfort only in the eyes of lions, the rumble of elephants, the quiet grace of leopards. They asked nothing of him but respect. They judged nothing. They existed, honestly and simply. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed how high the river ran. Last night's storm had been a violent one. Lightning tore across the sky like the world was splitting open, and rain had hammered the land until the dry earth softened into mud. Now the sand river surged with thick brown water that swallowed entire branches and carried them downstream with reckless force. The floodwaters always brought trouble, displaced animals, broken nests, and too often, tragedy. Elias stepped closer to the bank and crouched, inspecting the wet soil for tracks. He found impressions of a hyena clan, elephant calves, a lioness with 3 cubs, and he paused, his breath catching slightly. Leopard tracks, fresh, just hours old. The pads were slender, the stride measured and silent, a mother, and likely a young cub traveling at her side. He raised his head slowly, scanning the dense foliage across the river. Leopards in Sabi Sands were shadows. More than animals, quiet, secretive, elegant in their solitude. Seeing one was a gift. Tracking one was an art. Just as he rose to continue his patrol, a sound ripped across the roaring river, a cry, small, sharp, desperate. Elias stiffened. The coffee sloshed in his cup, forgotten. He took one step toward the sound, then another, his senses sharpening the way they had in his youth, every muscle alert, every breath controlled. The cry came again. It was not the call of a bird, not the whine of a jackal. It was the unmistakable, heart-piercing call of a leopard cub. His eyes darted along the water, and then he saw it. A small, spotted body was tumbling in the current, rolling, twisting, struggling to keep its head above the flood. The cub's tiny claws scraped uselessly at the rushing water. Its mouth opened in silent panic before it vanished beneath the surface for several agonizing seconds. Elias's heart lurched. His mug dropped into the mud. Without thinking, he ran. His boots pounded the soaked earth. Branches sliced at his arms and legs as he sprinted beside the river, following the bobbing, fragile life being swept toward a cluster of boulders downstream. The cub's head surfaced again, its eyes wide with terror. It was losing strength. Every second mattered. Elias's mind flashed, not with fear, but with memory. 20 years ago, he had watched a lion cub drown before he could reach it. The river had outpaced him then. He had carried that guilt for decades, buried deep, trying to silence the small, accusing voice that whispered failure on stormy nights. Not today. Never again. As he ran, he shrugged off his backpack and tossed it onto the ground. He tore off his jacket, his breath burning as he jumped over a fallen log and skidded down a steep slope toward the water's edge. The river thundered past him, cold spray striking his face. He judged the distance, too far to grab, too fast to outrun. But there, just ahead, a fallen acacia tree jutted into the river at an angle. If he reached that, he could intercept the cub. He ran harder, lungs aching, feet sliding. Mud pulled at his boots as if trying to hold him back, but Elias pushed forward with the determination of a man whose soul refused another scar. He reached the acacia trunk just as the cub rushed toward it. Without pausing to calculate the risk, Elias grabbed a branch, braced one foot on a rock, and leaned dangerously over the churning flood. His fingers stretched, straining, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. The cub slammed against the trunk, yelping. Elias lunged. His hand closed around a small, soaked body, and he pulled. The cub came free of the water with a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. Elias fell backward onto the mud, clutching the trembling creature against his chest. It coughed weakly, water bubbling from its nose. Tiny ribs heaved beneath drenched fur. "You're all right now," he whispered, though his voice shook. "You're all right." But as the cub blinked weakly up at him, Elias felt it before he saw it. A presence, a weight in the air, a silence so sudden it was like the world inhaled and held its breath. He looked up slowly. Across the river, barely visible between the dense foliage, stood a full-grown female leopard. Her coat glistened with raindrops. Her whiskers twitched. Her tail swayed low and tense. Her golden eyes, sharp as arrowheads, were fixed directly on him. Elias did not move. His pulse throbbed in his throat. The mother leopard emerged fully from the shadows. She was magnificent, large, muscular, her rosettes contrasting against the pale morning light. She was breathing hard, sides expanding in rapid rhythm. She had been searching, she had been calling, and she had seen her cub nearly die. Now she saw the human holding it. Elias knew leopard mothers. They were fierce, loyal, and protective beyond measure. She could leap across the rocks, she could cross the shallows, she could be on him in seconds, but she didn't. Instead, something unexpected, almost uncanny, happened. The leopard softened. Her ears, which had been pinned back, rose slowly into a neutral position. Her tail stilled. Her posture shifted not into aggression, but into an alert, cautious calm. She watched him, not with rage, but with a piercing focus, as if evaluating the truth of what she was seeing. A fragile, silent exchange flowed between them. Elias held the cub close, but not possessively. He lowered his gaze slightly, a universal gesture among predators. "I am not a threat. I'm not claiming you're young." The mother blinked, slowly, a sign of trust. Elias exhaled shakily. He remembered something an old Sangha tracker once told him. A leopard knows the heart of a man before she knows his footsteps. And now, this mother seemed to know his. Still, he had to act. The cub needed warmth. If the river had chilled it too deeply, hypothermia could take its life even on dry land. Elias rose carefully, keeping his movements gentle. The mother leopard did not growl. Her muscles remained taut, but her eyes followed every moment with a strange, searching intensity. Elias backed away from the water, step by slow step. The leopard mirrored him, moving along the opposite bank. When he reached a safer distance, he knelt behind a large boulder and placed the cub down on a dry patch of grass. It whimpered, shivering violently. Elias removed his own shirt and wrapped the cub inside it, drying the tiny body with careful rhythmic motions. The cub sneezed pathetically. Elias smiled, a small, aching smile. He had seen so much life fade, to feel a little spark fighting to stay. It stirred things inside him that had long been quiet. He kept one hand on the cub and raised his gaze toward the mother. She was closer now, directly across from him, only the water separating them. She paced once, twice, then stopped. Her tail twitched, her head tilted. She seemed to understand. Carefully, Elias lifted the cub again and moved closer to a section of the river where stones jutted out, forming a natural stepping path. The water here was shallower, less violent. The mother noticed. She stepped forward, her paws light and deliberate on the wet rocks. Elias crouched, his arms extended. He held the cub toward the water, but not over it, giving the mother time to approach without panic. The cub gave a tiny cry, weak but alive. The mother's ears flicked at the sound. She stepped onto the first stone, then the second. Her tail rose for balance. She tested each foothold with precision. Elias did not breathe. When she reached the closest rock, just a meter away, she paused. An enormous wild predator and an aging ranger watched each other across a small stretch of river, linked by a fragile bundle of life. Elias opened his arms. The cub wriggled weakly. The mother let out a soft, guttural chuff, a sound rarely heard from a leopard, a sound of reassurance. Elias gently leaned forward and placed the cub on the nearest flat stone. The mother moved immediately. She nuzzled the cub, licking its face, pulling it toward her with a tenderness so fierce it made Elias swallow hard. The cub responded with a tiny, pitiful purr. Then something extraordinary happened. The leopard lifted her head and looked back at Elias. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds, not with fear, not with anger, but with something that felt, impossibly, like recognition, like acknowledgement, like gratitude. And then she did the unthinkable. She bowed her head, a simple lowering of her chin toward the stone, a gesture so subtle, so fleeting, that had Elias not been staring directly at her, he might have missed it. But he didn't, and the meaning of it hit him like a physical force. A thank you from a wild leopard. The mother picked up her cub delicately by the scruff and turned back toward the forest, stepping with power and grace across the rocks. She vanished into the undergrowth, swallowed by the same shadows from which she'd appeared. Elias remained kneeling on the river's edge long after she disappeared. His shirt was soaked. His arms trembled, not from effort but from emotion. Something old inside him, some long-buried weight, shifted, loosened, softened. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his back as he stared at the place where the leopard had vanished. He thought the story had ended there. He was wrong. That was only the beginning. For days after the rescue, Elias found himself returning to that same stretch of river. He told himself it was habit, routine, patrol duty. But in truth, something pulled him back, an invisible cord of curiosity, hope, maybe even longing. He wondered if the mother had moved the cub to a new den, if the little one survived the cold it had endured, if that silent moment of exchange had meant anything beyond instinct. Elias had always believed animals remembered kindness, perhaps because he needed to believe it on the 4th morning as the mist curled between the reeds and sunlight filtered. Like gold dust through the trees, he found something that made his breath catch, a track, tiny, fresh leopard cub, and beside it the larger tracks of the mother following a circular path near the tree line. Moving slowly, waiting. He froze. She had returned. She was watching him. He couldn't see her, but every hair on his neck stood up. The air held a familiar density, the feeling of eyes on him from somewhere above, somewhere hidden. Leopards were masters of invisibility, but Elias had learned to sense their presence the way one senses weather changes. He lifted his head slowly. There, on a low branch of a knobthorn tree, she lay, half concealed, half illuminated by morning light, the mother leopard, and beside her, pressed against her flank, rested the cub, alive and healthier than he'd dared hope. Elias exhaled softly, relief warming him from the inside. The mother blinked at him, not with the slow, tentative trust of the river moment, but with something firmer, a confirmation. She recognized him. The cub mewed sleepily. Elias smiled despite himself. For weeks that followed, an unlikely ritual took shape. Whenever Elias patrolled the river at dawn, the mother leopard appeared, not close enough to touch, never recklessly, but always within sight. Sometimes she perched on a branch, sometimes she sat among the tall grasses with only her rosettes visible. Sometimes she stood atop a boulder, silhouetted like a goddess of the wild, and always the cub was with her, growing stronger, bolder, more curious. On some mornings, the cub would approach a few steps toward Elias before the mother softly chuffed, calling it back. The cub would obey, mostly. But each day, the distance closed a little. Elias never fed them, never coaxed them, never overstepped the fragile boundary between coexistence and intrusion. He offered only presence, respect, quiet companionship. And in return, the mother showed him something he had rarely been granted in all his years, a bond not born of dependency, but of recognition, a bond chosen. As the dry season deepened, the land shifted. Grass grew brittle, waterholes shrank to muddy rims, animals moved in patterns shaped by survival. And still, the mother leopard and her cub remained near Elias's patrol routes, weaving their lives like shadows around the edges of his. Then came a day that tested the bond in ways he could never have predicted. It was late afternoon when Elias heard the alarm calls of impalas, a staccato symphony of fear carrying across the plains. He quickened his pace, heart thudding. Alarm calls meant danger, often lions, sometimes hyenas, occasionally poachers, but when he reached the clearing, he found something else entirely. The young leopard cub was cornered near a cluster of rocks, surrounded by a pack of hyenas. 3 large adults circled it, laughing in their eerie, mocking voices. The cub hissed and swatted, but it was no match. The mother leopard was nowhere in sight. Elias didn't hesitate. He shouted it. The hyenas, raising his arms, throwing a stone near their feet. Hyenas were bold, but they respected dominance and fear. He bellowed again, stepping between them and the cub. The hyenas paused, measured him with their restless eyes. One snarled, another paced. But after a tense few seconds, they retreated, slipping back into the bush with annoyed, grumbling murmurs. Elias turned to the cub, shaken, panting, fur ruffled. The cub looked up at him, eyes wide. For the first time, it did not run. Instead, it pressed itself lightly against his boot before pulling back with a faint chirp. The sound cut straight through him, but the moment was interrupted by a rustle. The mother leopard arrived, silent as a falling leaf. Elias stepped back instinctively as she approached the cub, sniffing it, checking for injuries. She then turned her gaze to Elias. This time, her look held something deeper, understanding, acceptance, gratitude layered upon gratitude, and something else, a decision. From that day forward, the bond between them changed. The mother no longer observed Elias from a distance. She allowed herself to be closer. She revealed more of her life than leopards typically do to any human. She let him witness her hunts, her rest, her teachings to the cub. Often, she would leave the cub within view of Elias while she patrolled nearby, trusting him to watch over it if danger approached. Elias, in turn, found purpose blooming within him, purpose that eased the loneliness he had carried for so long. He spoke to the leopards sometimes, not expecting understanding but needing release. He told them stories, memories, regrets, hopes, and though they were wild creatures, their presence was an answer. When the cub grew older, nearly a year, the mother began encouraging it to explore further. One dawn, Elias awoke with a strange heaviness. He sensed a shift, something turning, something ending, something beginning. He patrolled the river as always, and there, waiting in the soft glow of morning, was the mother leopard alone. She stepped out from behind a bush, walking toward him with deliberate steps. Elias's chest tightened. She stopped just 10 meters away, closer than she had ever dared before. Her golden eyes fixed on him. She blinked once, twice, slowly. She bowed her head again, and then, without a sound, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Elias waited the entire morning, but she did not return. The cub did not appear either. He understood. She had led her young one into a new territory, as all leopard mothers eventually must. She'd come to say goodbye, to mark the closing of a chapter written not in words but in glances, gestures, and moments of shared trust. For the first time in years, Elias felt something slide down his cheek. He wiped it away, pretending it was sweat. But the truth was softer, tender, human. Later that evening, as the sky blazed in hues of amber and crimson, Elias sat on a boulder overlooking the river. The waters had returned to their calm, steady rhythm. The storm of months before felt distant, like a story he had been told rather than lived. He remembered the cub's tiny, soaked body trembling in his hands. He remembered the mother's bowed head. He remembered the morning she came to say farewell. And he realized that some bonds in the wild do not end. They evolve, expand, carry forward like ripples on water. The leopards were gone from sight, but they had left their imprint on his soul. Sometimes at dawn or dusk, when the light turned the world gold and shadows stretched long across the grass, Elias imagined he saw a spotted shape watching him from afar, not close, not near enough to approach, just near enough to remind him that the bridge between their lives still stood, the one forged on a storm-born river, the one strengthened with every silent exchange, the one sealed with a gesture so small and yet so profound it could only be described as a miracle of understanding. Elias smiled into the wind. In the vastness of Sabi sands, he was no longer alone, and somewhere among the marulas and knobthorns, a leopard and her grown cub carried within them the memory of the man who once pulled life from the floodwaters and asked for nothing in return.